All right, here we go with our second set of notes in our evolution unit. This one we're going to talk about evolution and what adaptation actually is and what survival of the fittest is and all that fun stuff. So the first thing we need to talk about is this concept of descent with modification. Now we talked about Lamarck already, and we said that yes, organisms can change, but a lot of times those changes that happen to an organism in their lifetime aren't something that's actually passed down to their kids. It's not what we call it's an inheritable trait. What Darwin figured out was that changes in the phenotype are passed on to the offspring in the genotype. Now, if you call back to Biology 1, remember genotype is the type of genes you have, that's your genetic makeup, and the phenotype is what you actually see. So basically, you could have a good phenotype, something that helps you out, and if that helps you out, then you obviously have the genotype that gives you that phenotype. And the genotype is something that you can be passed on to your kids. So just to be clear, this is something that you're born with. It's not an acquired trait. So what does this mean for natural selection? Natural selection then is pretty simple, and you guys probably know the idea anyway, but the organisms with more beneficial traits in their given environment tend to pass these traits on to more offspring than those without the beneficial trait, so that eventually the population has more of the trait. So if you want to go back to our cell phone example, if you think about it, right, if you had a friend with one of those really, really old cell phones that was really big and clunky and couldn't go on the internet or anything like that, you'd probably laugh at them. That would not be a very beneficial trait, and so they would probably get rid of that phone as soon as they could and get something with a better trait. So that's kind of what's driven the evolution of the population of cell phones. So in the population of cell phones now, you never see one of those old brick cell phones anymore. Nobody has those. If you were to think more about natural populations, go back to Lamarck's giraffes. Darwin would have said, no, that's not how it worked. So there's lots and lots of different giraffes, and all giraffes are a little bit different. Right? So some giraffes would have necks that are slightly larger, some necks would be slightly smaller. So the ones with the longer necks would just naturally have an advantage. And so they would probably be able to eat more, so they would be healthier, they would maybe survive longer, they would certainly reproduce more, and then so the next generation would have more offspring of the long-necked giraffes than the short-necked giraffes. Maybe they died, maybe they were just too weak to reproduce, but for whatever reason, they didn't pass their genes on. That is the key part, right? Reproduction is where it's at. I'm going to say this all the time, but you've got to pass these traits on to the next generation for that to affect the population. Because remember, populations evolve, not individuals. That individual giraffe didn't change its neck. Some were just lucky and had longer necks than others. So the changes in phenotype were passed on to the offspring through the genotype. Another often cited example of this is peppered moths. So these peppered moths lived in England during the Industrial Revolution, and they kind of came in two different varieties. There was a white variety and there was a black variety. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, trees were relatively healthy, and what's more, trees were covered by lichen, which is this like algae, fungus symbiotic organism you guys are probably pretty familiar with. You can see it all over the place. And so this is pretty good for one color moth and not the other, right? If you were a bird, what type of moth would you rather eat? Well, you would probably pick this guy off pretty quickly. He would show up right away. But the white-colored moth would be a little bit harder to see. Maybe you guys haven't even seen him yet. So if you were to go out there and measure the number of moths in a population, do you expect there to be more white moths or more black moths? I would expect there to be more white moths, and that's exactly what there was. Now, when we have a selection event or a change in selection pressure, basically the Industrial Revolution comes along and starts spewing out all kinds of toxic chemicals and kills all of this lichen and probably even put some soot on the tree. So now you have this tree over here that's totally bare and no more lichen. Now if you're a bird, who are you going to eat? Exactly. This guy shows up nice and easily. So he would probably get eaten. Versus the black moth is going to now have the advantage, and so if you went out and sampled the population of moths at this point in time, you're probably going to find a whole lot more black moths, which again is exactly what they found. So we talk about natural selection, and oftentimes when we talk about natural selection, you hear this term survival of the fittest. And this actually wasn't even a term that was coined by Darwin. This was coined much, much later. And we tend to think of survival of the fittest as something like this down here, right, where the strongest survive and they outrun the weak. And a lot of times that can be true, but it isn't always about strength. I like to give lots of other examples, right? It's just an example of something that gives you an advantage overall in reproduction. 'Cause remember, reproduction is where it's at. In this case, fitness is your organism's contribution to the next generation. So a fit organism isn't somebody who's strong. A fit organism, evolutionarily speaking, is somebody who has a lot of kids, right? So it's not always about strength. This guy might get all the ladies, but maybe they're not interested in him. Or maybe he's so big and strong that he gets eaten by something else first, right? Maybe some organism has a couple extra spots, so they're better camouflaged, and so they're better able to hide from their predators, so they live longer and they reproduce more, right? Or if you wanted to go to extremes, you can look at the peacock here, right? The peacock with the bigger, brighter plumage is the one that's more likely to get the girl and have more babies. On the other hand, this could be a downside, right? He's got this huge tail trailing behind him, and this could actually make him easier to be caught by predators. So this could actually be a vulnerability for him, right? To illustrate this point, we've got a quick little movie to check out. So you guys may recognize this movie. This is from The Incredibles, and in this scene, Mr. Incredible is trying to get a uniform approved, and he wants a cape, and his designer does not want a cape.
Yeah. Yeah, something classic, like Dynaguy. Oh, he had a great look. Oh, the cape and the boots.
No capes.
Isn't that my decision?
Do you remember Thunderhead? Tall, storm powers. Nice man, good with kids.
Listen.
November 15th to 58. All was well, another day saved, when his cape snagged on a missile thing.
Thunderhead was not the brightest bulb.
Stratogale, April 23rd, 57. Cape caught in a jet turbine.
You can't generalize about this.
Metaman, express elevator. Dynaguy, snag on takeoff. Splashdown, sucked into a vortex. Knock it!
So clearly a good example of how excessive plumage, shall we say, is not necessarily a good thing. And the last little bit of terminology that we have to talk about that can be a little bit confusing is the term adapt. We often, maybe use that in popular language, such as like, oh, hey, we can adapt to changing conditions by putting on a coat or something like that. But it doesn't really work that way in nature. It certainly doesn't really work that way in an evolutionary point of view. Remember, from an evolutionary point of view, organisms don't evolve, populations do. So in this case, the exact same thing as far as adapt. Organisms don't adapt, populations do. So in this case, the population changes to survive better. Individuals do not acquire good traits that can be passed on to their kids, right? You don't take a grizzly bear that's big and brown and drop him at the North Pole and he says, oh, hey, it's really cold and really white, I think I'm going to put on my white coat now. It doesn't work that way. The whole population as a whole has to change. And with that, we are done with this set of notes.